Good morning. It's Monday, October 28th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 388 days old. I'm Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, filling in for John Chanzer today. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. As you probably know by now, there was major news this weekend in the Middle East. After Iran launched a barrage of approximately 200 ballistic missiles at Israel on October 1st, we waited for weeks to see how Israel would respond. Well, on Friday night, DC time, and pre-dawn Saturday in Tehran, we got our answer. Or more precisely, the Islamic Republic of Iran got its answer, the largest attack on Iran in Israel's history. More on that in a moment, here on the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is Dana Stroul. Dana is Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I consider Dana a good friend and one of the most knowledgeable experts in Washington when it comes to U.S. defense and foreign policy in the Middle East. She's had a long and impressive career in public service. Most recently, from 2021 to 2023, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the region. We'll catch up with her in a few minutes to discuss recent developments in the region. Well, this wasn't your average weekend, even in the Middle East. Following Iran's October 1 ballistic missile barrage, Israel conducted its retaliatory strike, and it was a big one. More than 100 fighter jets, air refuelers, and reconnaissance aircraft were reportedly involved. As one would expect, the first wave of strikes focused on air and missile defense assets. Some reports and sources claim all of Iran's strategic air defense capabilities were destroyed, including its S-300 air defense systems and an advanced Iranian-made model. Even if a majority of Iran's strategic air defenses were destroyed, that would be a major accomplishment, making any future strikes against Iran easier and more likely to be successful. After degrading Iran's air defenses, Israel targeted the regime's missile production facilities. One report called the damage, quote, crippling, unquote. Rebuilding those missile production capabilities will take time, but a word of caution, the destruction of ballistic missile manufacturing facilities is not the same as destroying Iran's existing ballistic missiles, and the regime retains a large inventory of missiles. Israel avoided attacking Iran's energy infrastructure for now. The Biden administration will be pleased with that decision. But the New York Times, citing 6 Israeli and Iranian officials, says Israel hit air defenses protecting, quote, oil and petrochemical refineries, as well as systems guarding a large gas field and a major port in southern Iran. That's a not so subtle message of what could come next. So what's the bottom line? Israel just conducted an incredibly complex, multi-hour, multi-phased, long-range military operation, demonstrating impressive intelligence and military capabilities. Israel's success has shown skeptics in Washington once again that the Iranian military is not 10 feet tall. But destroying Tehran's nuclear program is a different matter. So what now? The ball's in the Supreme Leader's court. As the extent of the damage becomes more widely known, he will be embarrassed and he may feel the need to attack Israel again. But the Supreme Leader will have to weigh those feelings against the realization that his air defenses are severely degraded and his ballistic missile production capacity is damaged. In short, the regime is more vulnerable than ever. If the Supreme Leader chooses to start another round of strikes, he'd be right to worry that Israel may hit energy, nuclear, or even regime targets next. So does Khamenei strike Israel again directly, or sit on his hands for now and return only to Tehran's longstanding terror proxy strategy? Or with its defenses degraded and Hezbollah on its heels, does this new vulnerability motivate the Supreme Leader to try to covertly sprint to a nuclear weapon between the U.S. election and Inauguration Day, perhaps depending on the result of the vote? You can trust FDD will stay on this and keep you updated here on the FDD Morning Brief. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the Israel Defense Forces destroyed a massive Hezbollah bunker along with a military base belonging to Hezbollah's elite Radwan force on Saturday. The bunker was nearly 1 mile long. It reportedly took Hezbollah 15 years to build and was large enough to house hundreds of terrorists, according to the IDF. Hezbollah was planning to launch its own October 7th style invasion in an operation called Conquer the Galilee. This bunker would have likely served as a critical staging ground for the attack. That was Israel's largest search and destroy operation in South Lebanon so far. The IDF Special Forces Combat Engineering Unit led the operation, which involved the use of 400 metric tons of explosives to demolish the bunker. The explosion was powerful enough to activate earthquake alerts in northern Israel. Headline 2, a mass casualty bus ramming took place near Tel Aviv yesterday. On Sunday morning, a truck driver slammed his freight truck into a crowd on Sunday at a bus stop in central Israel near the Mossad intelligence agency, killing one person and injuring dozens. At least 6 of the 35 injured were in a serious condition. Some victims were trapped under the truck for an extended period. And headline 3, Hezbollah fired a barrage of around 75 to 90 rockets at northern Israel yesterday. The IDF intercepted several, but some made impact. 3 people were wounded in Tamra. The attack is a reminder that Hezbollah, while degraded, retains the ability to attack civilians in Israel. Earlier in the day, 2 Israelis were injured when a Hezbollah drone hit an industrial zone in the Galilee. Footage from the attack showed damage to a factory that manufactures aerospace metal components for both civilian and military use. Meanwhile, the IDF announced that 5 soldiers were killed in a skirmish with Hezbollah on Saturday evening. 14 Israeli troops were wounded in the battle, 5 of them seriously. Now for today's guest, Dana Stroul. In the Pentagon, she led the development and execution of U.S. defense policy in the Middle East, as I said, from 2021 to 2023. Among many other impressive assignments and positions, she served for 5 years as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where she covered the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey, and oversaw U.S. foreign assistance and weapons sales, among other responsibilities. That's where I met Dana. I'm honored to have worked with her and to call her a friend. Now I'm excited to bring her insights to you here on the FDD Morning Brief. Dana, welcome to the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks for having me, Brad.
Oh, it's a real honor. Thanks for joining. Well, let's just jump right into questions. I'm eager to get your insights. Let's start with this. How do you assess Israel's strikes on Iran, and what do you think happens next?
First of all, I think what the IDF just displayed, a lot of it you covered in your topper, over 100 aircraft. The IDF also refueled themselves. They required no outside support to launch this operation. 3 waves of different strikes. Just remarkable. And when you consider that on top of what the IDF has achieved in Gaza in terms of dismantling Hamas's infrastructure and what it's achieved against Hezbollah in Lebanon, decimating the leadership of the organization and taking out all of these strategic weapons caches, it's just remarkable. And it's put the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, in a position to say publicly how successful Israel's military operations have been. I completely associate with what you said in your summary at the beginning. The ball is in Iran's court, in the Supreme Leader's court. And what they need to understand is if they respond, there's no question that Israel is going to counter respond. And in that counter response, Israel won't need to do 3 waves of strikes because that air defense is already decimated. Iran is vulnerable and exposed its critical infrastructure. And let me just say also, with the military production, the missile production facilities that the IDF took out, this is going to have implications not only for the Middle East, because Israel, the United States, and its partners have shown that ballistic missile attacks from Iran can be defended against, but it's also going to have implications for the Ukraine theater, because now we know that Iran, who's been supplying ballistic missiles and drones to Russia for its use in Ukraine, this is also going to damage that. And in terms of Russia's ability to resupply either the air defense or anything else to Iran, we know that the Russians are also stressed because they're now bringing in North Korean soldiers to support fighting that conflict. So major implications in 2 theaters.
During your time as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, you were a key leader involved with the U.S. Gulf Cooperation Council Working Group, which focused on, as you know, building a regional security architecture. Key elements included integrated air and missile defense, maritime security, Iran, and counterterrorism. Can you explain why that is a worthy endeavor, the current status of those efforts, and the path forward?
Sure. So first of all, let's start with how the threat environment has been evolving. When you look at what Iran can do with its lethal drone program, with its cruise and ballistic missile programs, what it can do in the maritime domain at sea, What's really clear in how we approach these challenges together is that unilateral options or bilateral response options probably aren't going to be sufficient to meet the security challenges of the moment. So, this idea of multilateral security cooperation, particularly in air defense and maritime, is actually something that goes back, I think, 4 Democratic and Republican administrations, multiple US CENTCOM commanders. And what we were doing, especially when I was at the Pentagon, is taking advantage of the emerging technology environment. So, sharing early warning, air radar feeds, integrating capabilities to collectively respond to these threats is cheaper and faster and more attainable now than it has been at any other point. And it also is about the political signal it sends that Arab partners and eventually Israel with the US GCC working groups and the United States. And I should add, in April, we actually saw European allies also participate. This is a rejection of what Iran is trying to do, which is destabilize the region. And we're showing that through political will and multilateral security cooperation, shared investments, exercises, all these different things, we can defend against Iranian threats.
Such a great point. Iran wants to divide and conquer, I would say, and the more we can team up with partners to create a coherent team, the more we can detect, deter, and defeat aggression from the Islamic Republic. It's a great point. Senator Lindsey Graham said he spoke with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last week and believes that an agreement to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia could be reached by the end of the year. Do you agree such an agreement is achievable, and what would be its implications?
I absolutely think it's achievable. In Washington and across the Middle East, Israel Saudi normalization is normalized. It's part of the narrative. The discussion is when, not if. And what's remarkable, after more than a year of IDF operations in Gaza and now in Lebanon, and a lot of regional frustration at the level of collateral damage and civilian casualties, the leadership in Riyadh has not taken normalization off the table. So here's the deal. There's Saudi-Israel normalization, but then also a suite of US-Israel bilateral agreements, civilian nuclear agreements, a mutual defense treaty. And these are also almost normalized in Washington. Discussion about the parameters and the timing and the Senate and what the Senate will do. But I think that if you take it collectively, what it does to underscore enduring U.S. commitment to the region, Saudi Arabia as the leader of the Arab world and the Muslim world, and also after what Israel's done militarily, the political statement of more integration and more normalization in the region as a way to counter, again, that nefarious Iranian activity is I think not only achievable, but something that we should absolutely be working toward.
From 2013 to 2018, as I mentioned, you served as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee supporting the Democrat leader, and then you spent 2 years working as a senior appointee in the Biden administration. How do you see the relationship between the Democrat Party and Israel changing or not changing now and into the future? More specifically, some far-left members of the Democratic Party have argued that the United States should not give Israel weapons and munitions. Do you believe that faction within the party will grow over time or remain a minority view in the party?
First of all, since you and I both have experience working in Congress and many different members of both parties at times, based on certain geostrategic circumstances, calling for suspending weapons sales or military aid as a form of U.S. leverage, I think it's important to just reflect on what this is. We've seen this play before, which is if we're concerned about a partner or an ally's actions, the first instinct often, both from the executive branch, it can be the legislative branch, and a lot of outside groups, is to call for conditioning or halting weapon sales or military aid. So the real challenge, I think, at this point in time for all members of Congress is how to continue to stand up for Israel's right to defend itself. And we haven't heard one member of Congress say, I don't support Israel's right to defend itself from terrorism, like what Hamas did on October 7th, or what Iran is proliferating throughout the region. But the question is, how do we engage with our partner to unilaterally to adhere to Israel's unilateral obligations under law of armed conflict, to mitigate civilian harm, to minimize collateral damage? And the fundamental question is it better to do that through dialogue and partnership, or through taking things off the table? And in taking things off the table, does that actually increase Israel's insecurity and vulnerability? Because Iran and its proxies would interpret that as a moment to actually increase escalation. So I think what we're hearing from members of the Democratic Party is concern over civilian casualties and collateral damage. And the bottom line is that any U.S. ally or partner who receives U.S. support, we want them to behave and comport themselves in the best way possible. We've had challenges with our own military, and every military in these kinds of conflicts is going to have challenges. And I should also note what's really important to recall here is it's not just what Israel can do. What do you do when you face an adversary who deliberately puts civilians in places of harm, embeds its terror infrastructure in civilian structures, mosques and schools and assistance facilities, diverts humanitarian aid? I think this is an active debate in Congress, definitely in the Democratic Party, and we should be able to have these conversations and actually talk about how Israel's doing the best it can in these situations. And also, we in the U.S. military are going to need to learn from what Israel has experienced in both Gaza and Lebanon. So I think we're going to continue to hear these kinds of concerns from members of the Democratic Party. And I think it's important for Congress to ask these tough questions. There's also the facts, and part of this is on the executive branch to demonstrate what it's actually done to make sure that Israel does the best it can for delivery of humanitarian aid, minimizing civilian harm, and preventing massive collateral damage.
Thank you. One quick last question here. What is your assessment of the change in you mentioned a bit of this earlier, but I want to hear a little bit more. What is your assessment of the change in relationship between Iran and Russia? And how do you think that evolving relationship will impact the Middle East and U.S. interests there?
So we've seen Russia step into the region multiple times to both align and work with Iran to achieve objectives in the Middle East. Generally, we've thought as Russia as big brother and Iran as little brother. And I think what's happening now is that leverage has shifted to Iran because Russia is reliant on Iran for drones to use in Ukraine, now ballistic missiles to use in Ukraine. And the question is, what is Iran going to get in return? I should also note here that what the Iranians are getting to do is see Russia use its most lethal weaponry in a battlefield, basically a battle lab, which is Ukraine. And we should expect that military cooperation, the defense technology exchange that we're seeing happen in the European theater will eventually migrate back to the Middle East theater and have tremendous implications for our partners in the Middle East. So the challenge here is not just Iran and Russia's close strategic cooperation, but the implications of that defense technology exchange, the kinds of more sophisticated capabilities that the Russians could give to Iran. And then, of course, we need to add North Korea and China to the mix. And that strategic cooperation between those three capitals is going to have implications for how the United States pursues its interests and its objectives in the Middle East, and also how it works with its partners, both in the Arab world and with Israel.
Dana, thanks for sharing your insights. It's great to see you again, and thanks for joining us on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks for having me, and always great to collaborate with such a dear friend. Thanks, Brad.
Take care. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD CEO Mark Dubowitz published a policy brief on Saturday regarding Israel's retaliation against the regime in Tehran. Mark lays out the details on the Israeli strikes and describes what might happen between the November 5th election and the next president taking office. On Friday, FDD released the latest episode of its Foreign Policy podcast. My colleagues Hussein Abdul Hussein and David Daoud join FDD founder and president Cliff May to discuss Iran's strategy in Lebanon, the situation there, and the path forward. Third and finally, on Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, FDD is hosting an event entitled The War on America's 2024 Elections, How U.S. Adversaries Seek to Divide Americans and Undermine Trust. I look forward to joining Suzanne Spalding from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as my FDD colleagues Mark Montgomery, Ivana Strodner, and Max Lesser for this discussion moderated by political reporter Maggie Miller. You can join too at fdd.org. That's it for today's program. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels too. And please support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. It's been a pleasure hosting this morning. I'm looking forward To next time, in the meantime, John Shanzer will be back on Wednesday, joined by our colleague Eyal Halata, who served as Israel's national security advisor for Prime Ministers Bennett and Lapid. He's quite the Iran expert, and they'll have a lot to discuss, so tune in. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Brad Bowman, signing off for FDD.